Atheists like to pick apart Genesis 1, and that's what is attempted in this video from the Friendly Atheist channel. The video is titled, Everything Wrong with Genesis 1 in the Bible. Hemant, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, deftly mixes humor with sharp criticism. I think he misunderstands Genesis 1, though. Let's take a look, and you can judge for yourself.
There are people who think the Bible should be taken literally, that it is inerrant. Those people haven't even read the first pages. Let's just go through the first chapter of the Bible and talk about all the problems in it, shall we?
Well, there are parts of the Bible that are meant to be taken literally and parts that are not. You have to figure out the genre before you interpret a passage. I don't think Genesis 1 is meant to be taken literally. I think Genesis 1 can most accurately be described as ancient mythology, or close to it, but it's sort of its own glorious thing, actually. And it teaches theological truth, not scientific truth. God created, the earth is God's temple, people are made in God's image to be his representatives, creation is very good and that it suits God's purposes, Yahweh is superior to the gods of the surrounding nations, and so forth.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Obviously, we could talk about the Big Bang and how God didn't just poof us into existence. But even if you think, as some Christians do, that God created everything at once through the Big Bang, none of this makes sense. God created the heavens? I mean, that's a synonym for the universe. So God created the universe and Earth at the same time in the beginning. Except the universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old, and the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. I mean, if you rewind the tape, they don't have the same starting point. And if you know anything about the early universe, darkness wasn't in the picture. For hundreds of thousands of years after the Big Bang, the universe was really, really bright. And where did this water come from that God was hovering over? The earth didn't have water until long after it was formed. It didn't come with a built-in pool. The early universe didn't have rain either.
He points out that the universe and earth were not created at the same time. Well, verse 1 may be an introduction to the rest of the chapter, so it may be a summary statement. But anyway, Genesis 1 is an ancient document and employs the science of the day as a means to imparting theological truth. The author's scientific knowledge did not include the fact that the universe was created billions of years before the earth, and God was fine to not correct this misconception. And the point is that God created, not how. He mentions that at the beginning of the universe, darkness wasn't in the picture. Okay, but here I think darkness is largely symbolic, representing anti-God forces and elements. The text is not trying to describe modern science. Then he rhetorically asks where the water came from. Well, many scholars believe that in ancient cosmology, the world was a flat circular disk with a hard domed sky and was surrounded by the cosmic sea by water. God was working with the ancient cosmology of the day, and water, the great cosmic sea, represented chaos.
And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Who was he talking to? There were no people yet.
Who is he talking to? Well, I used to think the other members of the Trinity, and that may be right. I now think the passage is referring to a divine council, angels and so forth. And I'll note that divine councils and speaking into existence were not uncommon in the creation myths of the surrounding cultures. Genesis 1 has touch points with, and is in communication with, those competing narratives. I think one purpose of Genesis 1 was to be a polemic over and against the main competing narratives, actually.
God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. God hasn't even made the sun yet. That's not until verse 14. So where is this light coming from? And how do we get evening and morning when there's no sun? Those words have no meaning when there's no sun. Also, darkness isn't a separate but equal thing. Darkness is the absence of light, just like cold is the absence of heat. Those aren't two different things, they are different amounts of one thing. God apparently couldn't pass a grade school science class.
Hemant points out there is no sun yet, so how is there light? Good question. There are possibilities, though. One is that ancient thinking was that the sun provided heat, but light came from elsewhere. This may sound shocking, but there is some evidence to suggest it. A second possibility is that this is a touch point with competing myths, as light appeared before the sun and others too. A third is that the light was provided by God, who is light, symbolically, and the author was not concerned with giving a literal account, and his audience would not have expected a literal account. He also mentions that darkness isn't a separate thing from light. Yeah, I get that. In this mythology, though, God forms through separating.
And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. It took God a full day to make the sky? It's empty. What was there to make? And how did we get evening and morning again? There's still no sun. But more than all that, look at the language. God creates this separation, this vault, but it sounds very much like a solid thing, like a roof over our heads. But there's no roof. There's no physical barrier from the rain. It's the sort of thing you would write if you didn't understand what gravity was yet. It also sounds like a flat roof. I mean, God separated the top floor from the bottom floor. I mean, if the earth were flat, this language might make sense, but spoiler, it's not.
So it took God a full day to make the sky? Well, the days are a literary device. There are connections there to texts of temple construction, and the inaugurations of temples took 7 days. The meaning is that the earth is God's temple. There could also be a connection to a human work week. Also, 7 is a highly symbolic number, evoking wholeness and completeness. Then he quips that the sky was empty, so what was there to make? But in ancient Near East cosmology and in the Old Testament, many scholars think the sky was perceived to be a solid dome. Many translations call it the firmament. It held back the cosmic sea. So there was something to create. And again, God uses the science of the day. He chose to make the first chapter of the Bible about theology, not about correcting the faulty science of the day. Hemant also stumbles onto the three-tiered universe. The ancients conceived of a top level above the dome, a middle level which was a flat earth, and a lower level below the earth.
And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. That implies that there was a time when water covered the entire planet, and then God mopped it up into one location. But our planet was never entirely water. I mean, there was a time when it had no water, so there was never any water to gather.
So one way God creates in the account is through separating and forming. In one theory of how to interpret Genesis 1, actually, God forms out of pre-existing materials, and the creation is functional creation, shaping and giving function, rather than material creation.
Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Again, evening, morning, no sun. Doesn't make sense. But how do you make plants that bear fruit and vegetation when you can't have photosynthesis because, again, there's no sun? And how come the land has to produce all this stuff now? So much for the God of creation. It's like the Bible says he created land, then thought, okay, I'm done now. They can do the rest of the work. Also, by this account, the first living things in the universe are plants and trees which are above ground. That's not true. The first forms of life were entirely in the sea. And they were single-celled organisms, not complex plants with the sort of sex organs that would allow them to produce seeds.
Hemant talks about the land bringing forth vegetation. This is actually another touch point with ancient Near Eastern literature. I think this just goes to show Genesis 1 was concerned with God being the creator, not how he created. He then points out that plants were not the first things to appear on earth. And yes, that's right. And this would be concerning if God inspired Genesis 1 to be a scientific account of history, but it's not. The order has likely more to do with a poetic device that is known as the framework hypothesis. In days 1, 2, and 3, God creates realms, and then in days 4, 5, and 6, God fills the corresponding realms. Then he rests on day 7.
And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good.
So for these verses, I'm just going to summarize some of what Hemant says to save time. He applauds that we finally get to the sun in day 4. He then points out that the moon is called the lesser light, even though it doesn't provide light by itself. Well, this may be another example of God accommodating on science, or it may be poetic. He then points out that it is odd that the sun and moon are portrayed as governing the day and night, but I see this as poetic. Also, he criticizes the text for saying that the sun and moon and stars were set in the vault of the sky, but I think the ancients did believe that the sky was a vault, and they didn't know the stars were so far away. And let me just point out that in the ancient Near East, the sun and moon and stars were considered to be important gods. With this in mind, you can look at Genesis 1 as saying that they are not gods, but objects that God created, or that the God of the Bible is superior to these gods. Either way, there is a theological lesson here, and maybe polemical elements as well.
And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. Again, God didn't even make those creatures. He let the water do it. How lazy can you be? But if you look at this timeline, God made living creatures after he made plants. That's not right. That's not what the fossil record shows, or any other piece of evidence. It's the other way around.
Now, he says God didn't make these creatures because it says, "Let the waters teem." But that is poetic, and verse 21 explicitly says God created. Now, next he points out that the timeline in Genesis 1 is at odds with what we know from the fossil record. And he's right. I take issue with old Earth creationists for that reason. But again, this may be an artifact of the framework hypothesis, the poetical structure of the account.
And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. God didn't make these creatures either. He let the land do it. Lazy. But if we're talking about creatures that move along the ground, insects, reptiles, things like that, they were around for hundreds of millions of years before those other wild animals. And they all originated in the sea, not the land. Also, livestock, we domesticated cattle. They never lived in the wild.
He says the text says God didn't create. But again, that's not true. Verse 25 says so. Also, verse 24 may be poetic.
Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Let us make mankind? Who's us? Who else is hanging out with God doing all this? Are there other gods he's not telling us about? And how do we get to rule over these other creatures when, if you accept science, the fish and the birds and the wild animals were around for millions of years before humans ever entered the scene? It's a very cocky thing to say, you know all these creatures that have been around for millions of years? I rule them now. I've been around for like 1 day. It's like Christopher Columbus saying, I discovered this land that these native people have been living on for generations. As a vegetarian, this verse is also terrifying because it's been used as justification for why we can slaughter animals and shoot birds and just be cruel in general, because God said we rule over everything. Who cares about climate change? The earth doesn't rule us, we rule it.
Who is us? As before, perhaps the Trinity, but I think a divine council, angels and so forth. And I see no problem with humans being latecomers to the earth and yet ruling over animals. I get the humor, though. Now, I can see where he views the verse as being terrifying. The word rule may have a military sense. It may be harsh. But if you need to live in this harsh world, especially before modern technology, you need to subdue it. But this should not be taken as license to mistreat God's creation. Instead, we are called to be good stewards of creation, and that goes for climate change, too. Let me also point out a key message of the text is that we were created to be God's representatives and to be in relationship with Him. In multiple competing creation accounts, humans were made to do work for the gods. So Genesis 1 was truly revolutionary.
So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. I know this verse has been used by conservative Christians to reject evolution. I mean, God created us as is, therefore, even the thought of evolution is blasphemy. And yet all the evidence ever found, says we did not just arrive on the scene like this. That line is also used to justify their awful treatment of transgender people. They say trans people don't even exist because God created this binary. But just for the sake of argument, if God created mankind in His own image, and they came out male and female, what does that say about God? Is God somehow both? And it also sounds like God created male and female at the same time. Yet later on, literally a chapter later, we learn Eve was created from Adam's rib. He came first, then her. Which is it?
By the way, this is Hebrew poetry for emphasis. It is the climax of the story. As for evolution, I accept evolution, as do many Christians. But yes, sadly, many Christians use this verse to reject evolution. Now, as for there being a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, well, actually, I think these are two separate creation accounts, which is another reason to think that the compiler of Genesis did not expect the reader to take the accounts literally.
God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Telling two people to fill the earth is just wildly uncalled for. I mean, it really places an inhuman burden on the woman who basically can't do anything other than be pregnant and pray for octuplets every time. I know death doesn't even exist yet in this narrative, but still, give Eve some rest. I would so much rather have a God that says, fill the earth, eventually. But here's a condom if you just want to take a break for a bit.
He says asking two people to fill the earth is uncalled for, and I get it as humor, but the Genesis 1 text does not say there were only two, and in general this is just a blessing. God wants us to flourish.
Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. If that's true, then why are so many plants poisonous? There's a reason parents don't tell their kids to run in the garden in the backyard and eat whatever you find. Not all of it is good or healthy. I mean, if anything, if all plants are ours for the taking, does that mean God is pro-marijuana?
Hemant points out that some plants are poisonous. Okay, that's a good point. But hey, the text was not meant to be taken hyper-literally. The author likely felt he didn't need to add that extra clause, except poisonous ones. The audience would understand.
God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Was it good, though? I mean, God designed a world where death could enter, and we could suffer, and the animals would turn on each other and become predator and prey, and climate change could occur. It's not a utopia, not even then. The word Eden has become synonymous with perfect, but the whole place was still a breeding ground where eventual chaos could thrive. God could have used that seventh day to create a buffer of some kind, but he rested. Thanks for nothing. There's a group called Answers in Genesis. They're the ones behind the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter that believes everything we need to know about our origins is contained in the book of Genesis. But just from the first chapter, it's easy to see that the answers are not in Genesis. There are only more questions.
First, I'll point out the text does not say creation was perfect or a utopia. It just says very good, which I take to mean it suits God's purposes. Now, as for how could creation be very good, given that there was death and suffering right from the beginning? Well, these are good questions, and very difficult ones. I don't currently have answers that I find 100% satisfying. A full discussion of these issues is beyond the scope of this video. They are fair questions to raise, however. As for God resting, I get the humor, but just to point out, in the passage, resting means sitting on his throne and ruling. That's the ancient Near East context. Finally, as for answers in Genesis, I agree they completely missed the boat on Genesis 1 and on lots of stuff. But I think Hemant misses some key points too. In particular, I think he makes one similar mistake to that of answers in Genesis. I think Hemant reads the text through modern eyes, expecting modern science in the text, and is not fully informed of the ancient Near Eastern context of the account.